Hi, we're back with a conversation that could change the way you think about the authority of science and medicine in this country and whether or not you vaccinate your kids, or at least how you ask your doctor questions when the subject comes up. A study years ago linking autism to the MMR vaccine still very much in the public consciousness of this country. Even more than a decade later, parents afraid to give their kids those shots. But now the British Medical Journal calls the entire thing an elaborate fraud. Add to that troubling findings that in America, scientists are more likely than scientists from anywhere else in the world to commit research fraud, and one is forced to consider this critical question between the corrupting influence of corporations and fraud from scientists, frequently taking money from those corporations, manipulating data to further their careers and line their pockets. How much distrust and skepticism is appropriate for science, which is a business based on the practice of skepticism? Joining us now, Dr. Grant Steen, President of Medical Communications Consultants. And Dr. Steen, just how frequent is it that we see fraudulent research manufactured by American scientists in this country, and what can we do to protect ourselves from it?
Well, it's a difficult question. I looked at fraudulent papers and retracted papers from 2000 to 2010, and I found 788, of which about 260 were from the United States. To put that in context, the research output of the United States is far larger than any other country, so it perhaps isn't surprising that we produce more fraudulent papers. But the other thing to consider is that during that period, almost 5 million papers were published, and only 788 were retracted. You used the example of scientists and politicians before. It's as if politicians put out 6,000 press releases and only one of them was wrong. Or to think about it in another way, as if your weatherman made a forecast for tomorrow's weather and got it wrong once every 16 years. So I think on the whole, the scientific enterprise is really very strong.
If you were to look at the motive or reason behind a fraudulent paper, and really, based on what you just said, I feel that the entire premise of my conversation is largely flawed, and I apologize for that, because it sounds like there isn't a problem. But to the extent to which the flawed papers do come out, what tends to be the reason, or is there even any insight as to why and how that happens? Or is it as simple as one bad press release out of 10,000 is going to happen and you just got to get over it?
It's a tough question, and I've been thinking about it a lot, because if science really is self-correcting, then coming out with a fraudulent paper is ultimately self-defeating. You're going to discredit yourself. So why would someone do it? I really honestly can't say I know the answer. But on the other hand, why do bank robbers rob banks? They know that there's a likelihood that they're going to get caught. I suppose that any given bank robber thinks that he's not going to be the one who's caught. And the motivation may be that simple for scientists as well. And
joining us now, Brian Deere, who's the journalist who broke the story about the autism study fraud. Brian, specifically, how damaging was that one study?
Well, that one study was extremely damaging. It caused a great deal of harm. It caused outbreaks of infectious disease. It caused epidemics of guilt among parents and fear among other parents. But I was interested by this idea that somehow science is self-correcting and research fraudsters are bound to be caught. It cost something like $10 million in investigative work by the General Medical Council in the UK, by myself, about most of the last 7 years of my life in order to nail this fraudster on just one paper involving 12 children. The question that really worries me is how much more fraud is going on where those kind of resources can't be applied to dragging these people out of their foxholes and exposing them.
Dr. Steen, how do you respond to that question?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Brian for this wonderful work. I think plowing through and documenting how this paper was fraudulent is a really important thing to do. I want to point out, though, that this is, I think, a pretty unusual example. This paper had an enormous impact. Most papers in science don't have anything like this kind of impact. And it hit a community of parents who were desperate for an answer, desperate to find out why their children were autistic. And so it got community acceptance far faster than it got scientific acceptance.
If you were to look...
But this was a peer-reviewed paper. This paper had gone through all the processes. It was published in one of the world's most credible scientific journals and was championed by that journal for years. So the issue, I think, is actually much wider than the question of vaccines. It's a question of the integrity of science as a whole and what's going to be done about the fact that scientists and doctors know that they will actually get away with falsifying papers and the chances of them being caught are virtually nil.
I disagree.
Go ahead.
I disagree. I think the chances of getting caught are actually quite high. And I think this is an unusual case in that it took so very long to expose this fraud. There are other frauds that are exposed within a month or two. I think if you recollect Huang, the stem cell fraudster from South Korea, that was exposed in a month or two, and that had, if anything, a larger impact in the at-large community than the Wakefield paper did.
Brian, why do you disagree with that?
I disagree with that because the issue with scientific publishing is it all takes place behind the veil of anonymity. If somebody says we did a study of 250 women to see whether the contraceptive pill was safe and they were randomised in 2 arms and they were non-smokers of ideal body weight and they were aged between 35 and 40, we don't even know that those women even existed. Whereas in the situation of journalism, the kind of things that we do at NBC and with me, the Sunday Times in London, if we publish something, other people can go and check it. Our rivals can find out. If we say a plane crashed and 250 people died, that can be checked. You can't check what goes on in medical publishing. It's all done on a kind of old boys network of trust and confidence and assumptions that scientists tell the truth. It'd be like assuming that people who take part in sporting events can be guaranteed not to take drugs. What do? We have random drug testing of sportsmen. I think we need to have random testing of scientists where they think there may be a chance that an inspector is going to knock on their laboratory door and check their data.
Why would we not do that, Dr. Steen?
I would argue that we're already doing that the process is not flawed.
Aren't they anonymous? Isn't anonymous peer review an opportunity? So if I'm a scientist and you publish a paper and I'm reviewing it and your science is a threat to something that I'm already doing, can I not anonymously destroy your research in order to protect my own research? And that would be a more minor version, I suppose, than outright fraud. In other words, what is the resistance to transparency in the scientific community?
Well, you have to respect patient confidentiality. Patients will volunteer to be on a study with the assumption that their confidentiality is going to be protected.
What about anonymous peer review?
Well, their confidentiality is protected from people outside the institution where the research was done.
But what I'm not talking about the patients. I'm talking about the fact that if I file a paper with 10 doctors or 10 researchers who are then reviewing somebody else's research, that they don't have to reveal their identity or the fact that they may have a conflict of interest with the paper that they're reviewing.
That's certainly true. But my point is that a paper that arises from a hospital is protected from fraud for the most part by the presence of an institutional review board, by co-authors on the paper who should be double-checking the data. The fact that the Wakefield co-authors fell down on the job, I don't think indicts science in general.
Understood. Listen, a pleasure to have the conversation, guys. Dr. Steen, thank you. Brian, congratulations on an extraordinary piece of reporting. Journalism at its best. Truly, thank you, Brian.